Good evening and welcome again to our ongoing study of the Old Testament. We're in 2 Samuel tonight for those of you here as well as those of you joining us by video tonight. And we're going to start in chapter 11. We stopped with chapter 10 not only because we ran out of time, but it was also a great place to stop and start tonight with a great story. But before every great story, we should go to the Lord in prayer. So let us bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much, God. Lord, you have revealed yourself to us in mighty ways. Lord, we see your face in all of creation. But Lord, how special is it that you have revealed yourself in your mighty word. And God, we have gathered here tonight to learn more about you, to hear these stories told again. And God, we just ask that you be with us in a mighty way as we contemplate what we hear tonight. Lord, quicken our minds so that we might understand what is said, but also quicken our hearts so that this word would find good, fertile soil in our hearts and bear good fruit. We ask all this in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right, so in chapter 11, we start off in the springtime. And in the springtime, the scripture tells us it was the time when kings go off to war. So right there, the author is saying, David is a king. David probably should be off at war. But David's not off at war. He sent Joab, his commander, and all his army out to go do battle in some faraway place. And the king is just rattling around the palace. So he's hanging out in the palace one night. He gets up and he starts walking around on this. I'm guessing he had like an attached porch deck there. And he's standing on deck and he looks out and surveying the town below him. And he looks down and he says, "Oh, what is that?" He sees a beautiful woman down there taking a bath in the evening. He probably should have averted his eyes right then, not been a peeping Tom, but he kept looking. He said, "Man, that is one pretty girl down there." So he summons one of his aides and he says, "Hey, you see that girl down there taking a bath?" Yeah, the naked one down there. "What do you know about her?" And he's like, "Oh, king, man, that's so-and-so's daughter, but she is also the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Now, right then, so first of all, he should have been, if he had been off at war with his troops like he was supposed to be, this wouldn't have happened. If he had first averted his eyes, as soon as he looked down there and saw something he shouldn't be seeing, he'd have been all right. And third chance where he messed up is when he heard that she was a married woman, belonged to somebody else. That should have been it. But he says, "Man, she's perfect. Why don't you go down there, send somebody down there and bring her up. I want to meet her." So David sends for her anyway. She comes up and he makes love to her. We can't really say it's consensual because the power differential there. It was definitely not something that should have happened. And but David makes love to her. She becomes pregnant, and she sends a messenger back to David who says, "Hey, by the way, Bathsheba down there, you got her pregnant. What you going to do about it?" Well, David, he, instead of just coming clean and said, "Oh, you know what, big mistake, let's do the right thing here," he says, "Let's cover this up and nobody will ever know." And so he says, she's just barely pregnant. I bet you if I can bring her husband back from the battlefield, give him a couple of nights in town, a little R&R, shore leave as it were. He's going to go down to the house and he's going to have a nice supper and, and he'll sleep with his wife, and then, man, this will be all covered up. He'll think it's his kid. Man, this is a great plan. So he brings Uriah back, and on the pretext of wanting to get a report for how things are going on the front line. So he asks, "Hey, how's the battle going? How's Joab doing in charge of the army? How's everything?" "Oh, man, king, everything's going good. Joab's doing a great job." He's like, "All right, why don't you rest up a couple of days? Why don't you just go on down to your house tonight, get a good night's sleep, and we'll talk again in the morning." Uriah says, "Sounds good, king," and he walks out the door. Except he doesn't go home. He sleeps on the floor right outside the door of the palace. The word gets back to David that Uriah didn't go down to sleep with his wife, and he calls him and says, "What's going on, man? I thought you were going to go and spend a little time with your wife." He says, "Far be it from me." He said, "Man, my troops are out in the field still." He says, "Battle is going on. I wouldn't do that while they're out there." He says, "Not going to happen." And David's like, "All right, why don't you stay one more day? No need to get in a hurry to go back to the battle." So, all right. So that night, the king feeds him. gets his belly good and full, gives him a little bit to drink, gets him drunk, says, now, why don't you go home? Uriah's like, oh, okay, I'll go. Goes out the door of the palace and lays right there and sleeps right outside the door. David's like, all right, this isn't working. He said, man, I got to come up with another plan. So he comes up with and hatches a plan B. He writes a letter the next morning, seals it up in an envelope, gives it to Uriah, and says, I want you to take this to Joab, the commander of the army, go hand it to him, going back to the battle. Little does Uriah know that this note says, Joab, I want you to send Uriah out to the front lines of the battle, and when the enemy comes out to attack, I want to pull everybody but Uriah back. Just leave him hanging to dry up there, and then if he gets struck down, he gets struck down. Uriah doesn't even know that's in the note, but he's carrying it dutifully back to the commander. He takes it to Joab. Joab opens it up, reads it. Man, I don't know what this is about, but hey, David's the king. We'll do what he wants. So sends him up out to the front lines, right by the wall of the city. Archers come out from the city that they're besieging and start shooting people. Kills up a bunch of these Israelites and also kills Uriah. So Joab says, well, I need to get word back that Uriah is dead. So he takes a messenger and says, go back and tell all this to the king. He tells him exactly what to say. He says, now the king's probably going to get mad. He's going to say, why did you let the people get so close? Don't you remember the guy that was killed by the widow pushing a millstone off the city wall? Why did you get so close? He says, as soon as the king starts to rebuke you, say, and your servant Uriah is dead. And that should smooth everything over. And I'm sure this message is like, hey, this is weird. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, I'll go and tell him. So he goes back and he reports to David that a whole bunch of guys are killed. The battle's going well, but a whole bunch of Israelites were killed, and Uriah died. Now, I'm sure he's expecting David to fly off the handle and get mad at this tactical blunder that Joab made. But the king says, oh well, stuff happens. You win some, you lose some. Go on back and keep fighting. You tell Joab to go in and take that city. Messenger's like, wow, okay. He heads on back. Word gets back to Bathsheba that her husband is dead, and she goes into a period of mourning. After that time of mourning is over, David brings her into his house, and the only thing I can see that he has done right so far is after he has her husband basically murdered, he marries her to where she's not just left as a widow with no support. So he marries her, and he thinks he's gotten away with this. It's like, nobody saw all this except that the writer says God saw it, and God was not happy with it. And I tell you, that struck me when I read that again this afternoon. Man, we think we hide stuff all the time, and man might not see it, but God sees everything we do. So, and God was not pleased. So God uses a prophet named Nathan, who is kind of like one of David's chief advisors. And the Lord sends Nathan to David with a story. And he says, King, I want to tell you a story. There were these two guys in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. So, in other words, one had a position of power and one had, he was at a disadvantage. Now, the poor guy, he had this little ewe lamb. And man, he loved that little lamb. It was like a member of his family. He treated it like his daughter. Ate from his table, slept in his bed. I mean, this guy loved this lamb. While the rich man, now he had all kinds of flocks. Now, the rich man gets a visitor one day, and instead of going out and killing one of his own sheep to prepare a meal for his visitor, he says, I don't want to kill one of mine. I want to take the poor guy's little ewe lamb. And so he has that lamb taken, slaughtered, and prepared. David hears this story, and David flies off the handle. So he's not seeing it as a parable. He thinks Nathan's actually telling him a story that happened. He said, you know what? As surely as the Lord lives, the man that did that rich guy, he's got to die. And not only does he have to die, he should have to pay back, a whole bunch more than what he took. He didn't have to take that. He had everything. And Nathan looks at him and says, King, that man is you. Immediately, David knew that he'd been found out. David knew that God saw everything that happened. And Nathan goes on and says, "You're that man. Here's what God says about this." He says, "Man, I made you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you everything you could ever want. And you know what, David? If that had not been enough, all you would have to have done is ask. And I would have given you even more. This thing you have done is terrible. You despised the word of the Lord, and you did evil in my eyes." He said, "You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You killed him with the sword of the Amorites." Basically, somebody else might have done the deed, but you're the one that put him there, so you're guilty of it. Now, he says, "Because you've done this, there's going to be a price to pay." He says, "Therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and did this thing." He said, not only that, hold on. Let's say, out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. He said, "Before your very eyes, I will take your wives," and this is an important thing, we'll see this in a minute again. "I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did this thing with Bathsheba in secret, but I'm going to cause this abomination on you to be done in broad daylight before all of Israel. It's not even going to be hidden." David looks at Nathan and says, "You know what, Nathan, I've sinned. Man, I've done bad." And he repents of his sin, and Nathan says, "Well, the good news is your sin has been taken away. In other words, you're forgiven. God has forgiven you, but you're not going to die, but your son, the one born of this illicit relationship, will be taken away from you. He will die." So, after Nathan goes home, God strikes that child sick. Doesn't kill him right away, but the child gets sick, and David, it says, he put on sackcloth and he went into mourning. He fasted, he wept. People tried to console him. He would not listen to them. They tried to get him to eat. The whole time the child's sick, he wouldn't do it. All he kept doing is praying, "God, let my child live. Let my son live. Let my son live." After 7 days, the child ends up dying. The advisors that knew the child died, they're like, "What are we going to do? We can't go tell David that his kid's dead. I mean, look how bad he's off, and when the kid was alive, how much worse is it going to be when he's dead?" David sees them kind of whispering and talking, and so he kind of figures what's happened. So he gets up and he says, "Is the child dead?" And they're like, "Yeah, King, sorry to tell you, he's dead." Well, David gets up, he refreshes himself, puts on some lotions, everything, wipes the crusty tears out of his eyes, and then he goes and asks for something to eat. And he takes something to eat. Now, people are looking, going, "What's wrong with this guy? He's doing things backwards." He said, "When the kid was alive, he was mourning, and now that the kid's dead, he seems like he's okay. King, what gives?" And basically, David explains it this way. He says, "Look, I had nothing to lose while the child was alive, even though he was sick. And I just prayed and fasted and mourned, hoping that God would spare the kid if I just prayed enough." He said, "But now that the child's dead, what else can I do? I can't bring him back from the dead. What's done is done. God's judgment is over. I've just got to pick up and go on from here." David then goes to comfort his wife Bathsheba, because remember, this is her son as well, so you can bet that she's now upset that her son's dead. He goes to comfort his wife Bathsheba. He makes love to her, and she gets pregnant again. And she bears him a son, a very important one. His name's Solomon. And God, now we never hear him called this, but God sends word to David through the prophet Nathan to name him Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. Now, we never hear him called Jedediah, but you remember words names usually in the Old Testament have a specific meaning behind them, and that's what it means, because God saw that child and loved him. Meanwhile, Joab and the army is still out there fighting in that town called Rabbah. He is able to secure the city's water supply, but he can't quite conquer the town with the people he's got. So he sends word back to David. He says, "Man, you got to come with some troops here. We got to finish this town off." So David takes the army down there, takes the town, and then he ends up returning back to Jerusalem. Sometime later, the author says, in the course of time, so sometime later, Amnon, who is one of David's sons, falls in love with a girl named Tamar. A big problem with this is Tamar is his sister, right? But he's head over heels in love with this girl, and he just doesn't know what to do. He's beside himself, but he can't just, I mean, this is the dude's sister. I mean, what are you going to do? Well, much like his father David has to plan to get Bathsheba, who he wasn't supposed to have, he hatches a plan to get Tamar, his sister. He makes himself so sick wanting her that one of his aides sees and says, Amnon, what's going on, man? You don't look like yourself the last few days. He says, oh man, I'm just in love with my sister. I don't know what to do. And he's like, I know what to do. I've got a great plan for you. He said, well, let's hear it. He says, here's what you do. You go and lay in bed and pretend you're sick. I said, well, that's easy enough to do because I feel terrible because I'm so in love. Anybody that's been in love knows that it can make you feel bad. He's like, go lay in bed, pretend you're sick. Tell everybody that you want your sister Tamar to come and to make you a meal to make you feel better. And she needs to make it in your presence. So they go off and tell Tamar, hey, your brother's sick. He needs you to come and to make him a meal to make him feel better. So being a good sister, she goes. She bakes bread right there in front of him with her own hand, and she goes to feed him, and he refuses to eat. She goes, well, what's wrong? He goes, why don't you just send everybody out? Just you and me, and then I'll eat. So everybody gets sent out of the room, and she goes to feed him then, and he jumps out of bed, grabs her, and throws her in bed. He's like, come here, sister, I got to have you right now. And she goes, hold on now. You're my brother. This ain't right. Leave me be. He said, besides, you know what? Let's not do it this way. I know I'm your sister, but if you ask the king, who is our father, I'm sure he will allow us to get married, and that would be the right order to do things. Well, Amnon is so out of his mind with lust at this point that he just throws caution to the wind, and he ends up raping his own sister. But to make matters worse, as soon as he is done with the deed, he despises her in his heart. And he says, you know what? Get out. Get out. And she goes, no, because if you throw me out now, that's going to be worse than you raping me. Basically, she went in there as a virgin, and now she has been spoiled, and in her eyes, no man will want her. And she's probably right, given this culture that we find ourselves in. She goes, just don't cast me aside. We'll find a way to make this. He's like, nope, I'm done with you. I hate you. Don't ever want to see you again. Tells his people, throw her out, lock the door behind her. That way she can't get back in. She goes out, she tears the royal robe that virgins in the king's household would wear. Tears it, puts ashes on her head. She's wailing and carrying on. Well, her other brother, Absalom, which is also one of David's sons, hears and goes, what's going on? So she tells Absalom what happens. He has mercy on her and takes her into his household. Doesn't marry her, but takes her into his household and provides for the rest of her life. Word gets back to King David. King David is furious. Absalom's furious, but he never says a word to Amnon about it, either good or bad. The Bible says, he says, you know, he had that hatred in his heart. I don't know in Absalom's place if I would have had this much self-control, but he waits 2 years. He lets this fester for 2 years until he decides to exact his revenge on his brother for raping his sister. And basically what he does is he invites everybody, all of his brothers, as well as King David, to a party. He says, I want everybody to come. I'm going to throw the best darn party that we've ever had around here. David's like, son, we ain't got time for that foolishness. Man, we got stuff to do. He's like, I give you my blessing, just have a party, but we don't have time to partake in it. He's like, oh, yeah. Maybe if y'all can't all come, how about just send my brother Amnon? I really like that guy, and I think we could have a good time at this party. David's like, all right, go ahead, he can go. So Amnon goes down to the party, And Absalom throws a great party, gets Amnon drunk, and then he tells his friends, he's like, as soon as he's drunk, I want you to kill him. And don't worry about what happens, because I'm the one ordering, right? So if anybody's going to get in trouble, it's me. So Amnon gets drunk. Absalom's friends strike him down and kill him. And everyone takes off. Everyone hits the road. At this point, some of David's other sons are there as well. They see what's happening, and I'm sure they think, man, this Absalom's lost his rocks, man. He's going to kill us all. So everybody takes off fleeing. Absalom, he gets scared and runs. Well, first of all, David gets word that all his sons are dead. So a messenger comes and says, man, something happened and all your sons were killed. David's like, all of them? Man. Of course, we know that's a little far-fetched. Only one of them is dead. Absalom gets scared, runs off to a foreign land. David gets a little clearer picture. Somebody else comes and says, hold on now. Not all your sons are dead. Just one, just Amnon. But he was killed by your other son, Absalom. Absalom ends up staying in exile for 3 years. He stays in this far-off land. But while he's over there for these 3 years, David never invites him to come back. But David still misses it. I mean, this is his son. This is his own flesh and blood. He wishes he could have that relationship back with his son, but, in his mind and his heart, he's like, look, I can't bring him back. That just can't do it. Now Joab sees what a distress this is on David, and he hatches a plan to arrange to have Absalom come home. So what he does is, rather than going to David, because sometimes we just cannot go directly to somebody, because we know they're not going to be very receptive to our message. So sometimes we have to resort to some creative methods, and that's what Joab did. So he hires a woman. He says, I want you to go talk to King David. Now I'm going to give you a story. I want you to tell David this story, word for word. This is what it is. So he gives the story to this woman. This woman goes to King David. She goes, oh, King, I got a problem. I need help. King David's like, what's going on? She goes, well, I had 2 sons. And they both were out in the field one day, and they got to arguing. And one son picked up a rock and hit the other one in the head and killed him. Well, right there, dear readers, that's a hyperlink for us to go back to the story of Cain and Abel. Not sure that there's a whole lot of significance, but it does take my mind back there. She goes, so one of my sons killed the other, and now all the people around me are calling for my other son's head on a pole. She goes, King, I don't think it's right that I lose my one son. Now I'm going to lose the other son, and my husband's already dead. So, are you going to let him take my son from me? David's like, no, that wouldn't be right. Tell the folks to leave your son alone. She goes, I don't know if that's going to work. He's like, I'm telling you, you tell him King David said not to harm that son. It goes back and forth like this for a little bit, and finally she goes, you're quite the hypocrite there, King David. Well, she asked nicely first. She goes, can I speak freely here, King? King's like, sure, go ahead. You're quite the hypocrite. He's like, what are you talking about? She goes, is this not the same situation that you're facing? Did your one son not kill the other one, and yet you haven't welcomed him back? And so they go through that, and David sees through it by this point. He goes, is this a real story you're telling me, or did somebody put you up to this? Because this sounds a lot like old Joab. I think he's been wanting me to bring Absalom back for a while. She goes, oh, King, you're so wise. You saw right through it. Yes, Joab told me to say all these things. And so he looks at Joab and says, is this right? Did you put her up? And Joab's like, King, you're so wise, you're so good, but yes, I had to do something, and I wasn't sure you were going to listen to me, so I put her up to it. David's like, well, you guys are probably right. Tell you what, you go tell Absalom he can come home. So Joab has him brought back, and David's like, hold on now. I said he could come back, but I didn't say I was going to deal with him. He can go down and stay in that house down there, but I don't want to see his face. I'm still mad at him. So Absalom goes down there, lives in his house, but for 2 years, his dad refuses to even see him. Of course, Absalom can't just walk in and see the king, so he's like, you know what? I need an intermediary. he says, Joab has got his ear. Let me get Joab to go in and intercede on my behalf. So he calls for Joab to come to his house, and Joab ignores him. Joab already knows what David's going to say, so he's like, I'm not even messing with that fool. Again, he sends word, hey, Joab, I need to talk to you. Come to my house. Again, Joab ignores him. Finally looks and he tells the servant, say, isn't that Joab's field of barley right next to my house? They're like, yeah, that's Joab's field. He's like, I bet you if I set his field on fire, that's going to get that guy's attention. And so that's what he did. He had his servant set Joab's field of barley on fire, and guess what? It works. Joab comes down there and says, man, what the heck? You set my field on fire. He's like, look, I called you twice and you ignored me. I figure maybe now you say, okay, I'm here. What do you want? He said, I want you to go tell my dad I want to talk to him. So Joab goes up, brokers a deal with David. David receives his son Absalom back, and they end up reconciling. So all's well that ends well, right? Well, old Absalom is now back in his dad's good graces, but he's got greater aspirations for himself. And so he would go outside the city gates, and when people from all the tribes of Israel would come to Jerusalem to have their cases heard, maybe somebody did them wrong, right? And so they're coming to have the king or somebody else make a proclamation on their behalf. Well, Absalom sits outside the city gates and he says, hey, I see you're coming, Joe. Where are you from? Well, I'm from one of these tribes of Israel, and I come, because Mike stole my cow, I'm going up to get a judgment. And I'm Absalom, you're like, oh man, that's too bad. I don't think there's anybody here who can hear your case today. But man, it's quite a shame, because if just somebody would make me a judge, then I could handle this for you, and I would tell you that Mike's got to give you another cow. And he did this day after day, and in doing this, he ends up winning the heart of the people. After he so he's like a quintessential politician, right? He plays the people to get a power base behind him. Once he gets enough people behind him that he thinks he can pull off this coup we were talking about earlier, he goes to his dad and says, hey, Dad, I was wondering if it would be okay if I went down to Hebron. David's like, well, why do you need to go to Hebron? He said, well, when I was still in exile for those 3 years, I made a promise to the Lord that if the Lord blessed me enough to let me come back to Jerusalem, that I would one day go and worship him in Hebron. David's like, well, if you made a vow to the Lord, then you're going to have to keep it. So go on to Hebron, son, be blessed. Well, all Absalom is doing is trying to get out of town to go set up a base of power somewhere out from under the gaze of his father. And so he kind of gets up the support and he says, all right, guys, listen, I'm going down to Hebron, and when you hear the trumpet sound, I want everybody to scream out wherever you're at, that Absalom is the king of Hebron. And so he goes down to Hebron. Word of this plot, we're halfway through chapter 15 now. I'm not even keeping up with my Bible. I need to keep up with it. Word ends up getting back to David about his son's plan. He said, look, man, the hearts of all the people are with Absalom. Now, this can't be good. This is setting up to be a classic power struggle between you and your son, and we don't think it's going to end well. David's like, you know what? I think you're right. And I think if we hang out here in Jerusalem too much longer, he's going to come with all his supporters and catch us with our pants down here. So we might want to just sneak on out the back gate real quick. So David kind of gets all of his people together, gets everybody up, and they start heading out of town. And he's got a lot of people with him in Jerusalem. So he's standing there by the gate, watching everybody go. But he chooses to leave behind, not wives, but he leaves 10 concubines behind, kind of hold down the fort. He says, you guys stay here. Hopefully I'll be back soon, and I'll come for you. He watches these people go by, and there's this guy named Ittai the Gittite. He and his men they're relative newbies to Jerusalem. They're foreigners. They're not Israelites, but they have come into town, and David sees them marching out of the city, and he stops and he says, where are you going, man? He says, we're going with you, King David. He's like, oh man, you're just foreigners. You just got here yesterday. Why would I ask you to follow me around on a fool's errand. Man, why don't you just stay here? I'm sure everything will be fine with you. This is a hyperlink back to the story of Ruth. Remember Ruth and Orpah when Naomi says, oh, you don't want to go back with me. Y'all are foreigners. Go back to your dad's house. Orpah's like, okay, that sounds good to me. Ruth says, no, where you go, I will go. Well, this guy says the same thing almost word for word to King David. He says, no. He says, I'm your guy. You're my king. Wherever you go, I will go. My people are going to be your people. And so David's like, all right, well, welcome aboard. We're getting ready to get on out of here. Then a couple of priests come up with the ark of the Lord, and they're getting ready to take the ark out of town to follow David. David's like, whoa, 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 guys, where are you going? They're like, well, we're getting out of town with you. It's like, no, the ark's place is here in Jerusalem. He says, because I'm hoping that God will turn around and turn his face to me again, and that this will pass, and I'll be able to come back, and I want the ark here. He says, besides, you two priests, I want you to stay here and kind of keep an eye on things for me. So they take the ark back into Jerusalem, and then he hears about, and I'm not sure who this guy got into it, Ahithophel. He was one of David's advisors, and evidently David put a lot of stock in what Ahithophel had to say. Ahithophel. But he stays behind, and David hears that he was one of the conspirators against him. He was one of the inside men on this job. And so David prays to God and says, God, I know he's conspiring against me. I know he's going to stay behind, and when Absalom comes in, Absalom's going to look to him for advice. God, make him a moron. Just confound his advice and make everything he tells Absalom be the stupidest thing ever. And we'll see where that'll work here soon. So, David hits the road. Let's see. Okay. So shortly after leaving, David meets up with, you remember last week about a guy named Mephibosheth? That was Saul's his grandson, Saul's grandson. It was Jonathan's son. The one with the lame feet because he was dropped. Okay, you remember how David restored to Mephibosheth all that was Saul's, all that Saul lost and Saul's family lost. Well, David is fleeing Jerusalem. He doesn't get too far, and he runs into the guy Sika, who was Mephibosheth's servant, the guy that was supposed to kind of oversee everything since Mephibosheth couldn't keep up with it. Mephibosheth was supposed to be under David's protection for the rest of his life. He said he'd always eat from his table, right? Well, he goes out and he sees Sika. Sika comes to him and he's bringing him all this stuff. He's got all kinds of goodies and gifts. He's got donkeys. He's got raisins and bread and wine and all this. And David's like, well, what gives? He said, man, I got some good stuff for you. I know that you're going to be on a journey in the wilderness. You might get hungry. You might get thirsty. You might need something to ride. Well, here it is. He says, well, where's old Mephibosheth? He's like, he stayed behind in Jerusalem. He saw which way the political winds were blowing, and he decided to stay behind and see if he could cast his fortunes with the new king coming in. Well, this doesn't sit very well with David, and David says, well, I gave him back everything that was his grandfather's, but I tell you what, I'm taking it away and I'm giving it to you, Sika. And so he strips Mephibosheth of what he had been given. Meanwhile, they're walking along the road, and there's this guy named Shimei, and he was of Saul's clan. So he's one of Saul's people. And as you can imagine, he's not too happy with David anyway, because David overthrew all of Saul's household and was anointed king in Saul's place. So he's already mad about that. He sees that David's fortunes have turned, and so he comes out and he starts hurling insults at David and all his men. Now, David has got thousands upon thousands of people with him, but this nut job is out there cursing the king, throwing sticks, throwing rocks, throwing dirt clods and everything at him. And in the meanwhile, one of David's commanders named Abishai says, King, are we really going to put up with this foolishness? He says, I tell you what, let me go over there and take care of that little squirt for you. I mean, he'll be just like a bump in the road. We'll just take care of this. David's like, why even bother with him? You know, he's got a reason to be mad. And besides, maybe he's cursing me because the Lord put him up to it. And if the Lord put him up to it, what are we going to do about it? He says, either way, he's just one guy. No big deal. And so they continue on the road, and he continues to taunt them and to throw stuff at them until David and his men finally arrive at their destination. So they set up camp on the Jerusalem side of the Jordan River. So they're not too far out of Jerusalem now. Meanwhile, halfway through chapter 16, let us flash back to Jerusalem. Absalom and his men find out that the city has been abandoned, and so they come in to take up residence. And they are just living it up. Well, there's this guy named Hushai, which was one of David's advisors. David told him earlier to stay back in Jerusalem. He said, just stay here, you'll be my eyes and ears in Jerusalem. Well, Absalom comes in, and Hushai starts sucking up to the new king. and he says, wait a second, weren't you my father's advisor? He's like, your father's advisor, your advisor, what does it matter? I mean, there's a new king in town, and I'm your guy. Meanwhile, that guy, Ahithophel, is standing by, and Absalom says, what do you think? What do you think we should do? He says, well, I'll tell you what you should start with, good king. He says, I think you should go find those 10 concubines of your dad's, and you ought to have sex with all 10 of them, right here in front of God and everybody. And I tell you why I want you to do that. Because all of Israel will see it, and that's like you marking your territory. You've taken what belongs to your dad, and they will know that you have become despicable in the eyes of your dad, and they will solidify their support behind you. Basically, I mean, it's like, it really is. It's this macho, testosterone, mark your territory thing. And so that's what he does. He sleeps with him because he greatly trusted this fool's advice. Now, this is the same fool that David prayed and asked God to make him like a moron. Next, Ahithophel advised Absalom. He said, look, man, you need to get about 12,000 guys up right now and go chase after your dad. You got to strike while the iron's hot. I mean, he's running from you now. Chase him down, wipe him out, be done with it, and then you'll be the king. Absalom says, that's pretty good advice. But let's ask old Hushai over here what he says. Hushai says, man, that's a terrible idea, king. He says, your dad is mean as an old snake. He's probably holed up in some cave close by, just waiting on you to come out chasing. He's going to jump you, and you'll be wiped. All your army will be wiped out, and then what will people think? Man, they'll think, this Absalom, he's not even fit to be king. He's like, no. Here's what you do. You get you up a big army. He said, just bide your time. Get you a big army up, and then you go out, and your army will be so big that they can't even think about standing against you. You'll wipe them completely out, and people say, hey, man, this guy Absalom, what a great guy. I mean, he's just awesome. Absalom says, I think your advice is a little bit better. Meanwhile, some of David's spies that were there, they get word to two of the priests and say, hey, you need to go tell David of this plan that's being hatched against him. So these two priests go out, they sneak out of the city, they find where David's at, they're trying to sneak into this town where David's at, and they think that they're unseen, but sure enough, somebody sees them and sends word back to Absalom and says, hey man, there's two guys from Jerusalem coming in and they're trying to tell King David what's going on. So Absalom sends people after them, and much like the spies that enter into Jericho, who end up having Rahab has to hide, these two spies have to be hidden as well. So they go to this farmer's wife. She goes, you know what? Right here in the courtyard, I got this big well. Why don't you climb down in the well? So they climb down in the well. She puts a sheet over it, scatters some grain about where nobody can tell. Absalom's men come in. They're looking all over. Like, where are these guys? Where are these guys? Just like Rahab did. Remember what Rahab told the people about the spies? They're like, oh, I saw him go out the gate and went that way. Go get him. And all the men run. She goes, I think I saw him go that way. So the men go off that way. They look and they look. They can't find him. So they end up going back to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Ahithophel, he saw that his advice was not as good as Hushai's. He goes home, gets his house in order, and then he hangs himself. He commits suicide. Can't bear the thought that the king wouldn't take his advice. Let's see, chapter 18. David gets ready to do battle against the army of Israel. So he divides his army up into thirds. He appoints a commander over each regiment, which represents a third of his army. And he says, all right, guys, I'm going to go out here and battle with you. Well, one of his commanders says, King, that's not a great idea. You know, this whole thing will just fall apart if you end up getting hurt or killed in battle. Why don't you stay behind? Let us go out and do battle on your behalf. David's like, all right, if you think that's best, then that's what I'll do. So the army goes out, but before they go out, David's like, listen, hey, commanders, you three over here, I want to tell you something. He's like, go and fight well, but if you find Absalom, be gentle with him. He's my son. For my sake, don't hurt him. Take him as gently as you can. A lot of people heard this. Meanwhile, the armies go out and they rout the Israelite army. I mean, they just take them to town. 20,000 people killed, right? In the meantime, Absalom meets the army, and he turns on his mule, and he goes to hightail it out, and he had this long flowing hair, right? I mean, he was known for his hair. Every year he would cut it off and weigh it, and weighed 5 pounds. That's how much hair this guy had. So he's riding along, his hair's flowing, and all. He goes under a low-hanging tree, and that hair gets caught in a branch, yanks him off his mule, and there he is just dangling there by his hair. Can't do anything, just dangling in midair by his hair. Well, one of the soldiers from Joab's army sees him there. And he goes back and tells Joab, hey, I just saw Absalom hanging from his hair in a tree. And he's just there flailing. And Joab's like, why didn't you kill him? Man, I'd give you 10 shekels of silver if you'd come back and said you'd run him through. The guy's like, whoa, hold on now. I'm going to tell you what, I wouldn't have done it for 1,000 pieces. Everybody heard what King David had said. And let me tell you, if I'd have killed that guy that King David said not to kill, and the word got back to King David, I bet you wouldn't have said a word in my defense. You'd have just left me out there to dry. I said, no sir, I don't want no part of messing with the king's son. Joab's like, you know what? If you want a job done, you got to do it yourself. So he takes 3 spears or 3 javelins that he has, and he runs Absalom through while he's dangling there, defenseless. Runs him through with 3 javelins, doesn't kill him. So then his armor bearers go in and finish the job, just hack him up to pieces. They take him, throw his body in a pit in the woods, and cover it up with stones. Somebody's got to go back and tell David that the battle's over and it's been won. So one of the priests wanted to go, and well, he was of the priestly line. He's like, let me go run and tell the king. Joab's like, this is not going to be good news. You don't want to be the one to carry this news to the king. He says, hey you, Mr. Cushite, why don't you take off, go running, and go tell King David what's happening. So the Cushite takes off, like, boom. This guy is insisting. He's like, no, I'm telling you, I really want to go tell King David. He's like, why do you want to tell him? You're not going to get rewarded for this news. This is going to be bad. He's like, I just want to do it. He's like, all right, your own stupidity, go ahead. And so he takes a shortcut down through the plains, and he actually gets to the city where King David is first. Meanwhile, there's a guy kind of keeping watch in the city where David's at. And he's looking, he's like, hey, King, I think I see somebody coming. He's like, how many is there? Just one? Oh, man, if it's just one, it's got to be good news. He says, oh, wait, I think I see somebody else. Yep, it's another person running by himself. And David's like, well, if one person running is good news, 2 people running by themselves, got to be great news, man. This is going to be awesome. And so pretty soon the first guy gets there, which is the priest guy. And he said, man, tell me, what's going on? He said, man, David, man, you'd be so proud. Army fought well, decimated Absalom's army. David's like, man, that's great news. What about my boy? So he kind of ducks the question, doesn't answer. About that time, the Cushite comes in. David, man, you'd be so proud of your army. They fought so well. Man, the battle's over. We won. He's like, that sounds great. What about my son? He's like, Yeah, about that, king. I tell you what, may all of the king's enemies fall to the same fate as that young man did. He would not come right out and say, hey, your son's dead, but by the way he answered the question, David could infer what had happened. And so David ends up going up to a room above the watchtower, and he begins to weep bitterly for his son. Now, that's all we're going to cover tonight, but I just want to say, doesn't that seem kind of funny? His son comes up with a plan to overthrow him, to turn the entire nation of Israel against him, runs him out. Now, of course, I don't think he knows yet about his concubines, but I mean, sends an army after his dad to kill him, and yet when he dies, his dad is still overcome with grief. I mean, that's just something, isn't it? Well, we will pick up the story next week with, I believe, chapter 19. Yeah, we'll pick up with chapter 19. So we got through 18 tonight, and we'll pick it up with chapter 19. What are y'all's thoughts on tonight's story?
One thing that impresses me about David's story is, and I think we talked about it, you and me, about he wrote a lot of Psalms, and some of them, they can go back to certain times that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And Psalm 51 is credited to King David for when he
create within me
a
clean heart.
So I mean, we can go back and read what he was really going through to keep that in mind.
You know, that's very good that you made that connection between the two. In just about every Ash Wednesday since I've been a preacher, I've preached a sermon called "Create in Me a Clean Heart." I tell the story that we just read out of 2 Samuel of Nathan calling him out, and I use the 51st Psalm and go from there. So yeah, there's a strong connection there. I'm glad you made that connection with that song. And that was awesome. Old King David, boy.
And his kids.
And his kids. One has to wonder if he wouldn't have had a problem with Absalom had he not committed that transgression with Bathsheba, because remember God said, David thought God was just going to kill him. He says that you always have a sword in your house. And God also said that, somebody's coming to sleep with your wife right in broad daylight. Now, it wasn't his wives, but it was his concubines, and it was his own son that did it to him. So, he's getting here through his son Absalom, he's sowing what he reaped, I guess is what I'm saying.
Reaping what he sowed.
Reaping what he sowed.
I'm a little surprised about Absalom after he was the one who wanted to rush to take care of his sister.
Tamar, right.
And then he turns around and is just as bad.
Yeah. I mean, he starts off as, he's got a very high moral.
Could a brother marry a sister back then? Do you know if that's
I guess so, because, we talked about in Genesis about Abraham, him and Sarah would go into this town and he'd be like, oh yeah, that's my sister, that's not my wife, that's my sister. Yeah. And we talk about him lying, but in reality, he wasn't lying, because Sarah was his half-sister, and he married. I don't know about full brother and sister, but I know a lot of times marriages of convenience, for political sake or tribal sake, would have been allowed. The fact that it was even mentioned, I think it wouldn't have been common, but at least it would have been acceptable to the...
They would have taken them out and stoned them.
No, I don't think so. But it was preferable to what he was planning to do with his sister, and she's trying to, cooler heads prevail. She's like, look, let's just talk to Dad. I'm sure he'll let us get married, and, that'll at least be a little more right in the eyes of God. But, yeah. Crazy stuff in this Old Testament, isn't it?
And David's the man after God's own heart.
Yep. And
Well, I thought that something more was going to happen to him, though, when the Lord disapproved of what he'd done.
I would too, especially given the two transgressions that Saul made that cost him the kingdom and made God turn his back.
That's why I'm thinking David.
But we've said, and I know you and I have talked about it, the difference between the two was their response to that. Saul kept trying to blame everybody else. No, it's not my fault. Samuel, it's your fault for not showing up to do the sacrifice in time. I had to do that. I didn't put this guy to death and, get rid of everything because I wanted to use it to worship God, whereas as soon as David was found out, as soon as he knew that God knew, he repented. He was sorry. He prayed hard, mourned hard, and I think God was able to pour out His grace and mercy on him for that. Kind of like what I preached on today. David fell short, but the response was right and the grace was there.
But apparently his sons didn't share their father's faith.
I mean, it's amazing how many times in the Bible you see a faithful man and the son's going off the rails. All right. Well, folks, that's all I got. Go in peace. We'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you.
Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.